A 12-year-old boy from a small neighborhood was known for his big smile and polite manners. He was a typical kid, full of energy, helping his family around the house, doing his homework, and dreaming about the future. One thing he especially loved was basketball. He often spent evenings shooting hoops at a local court, imagining himself as a professional player. One chilly evening, after finishing his homework, his mom asked him to take out the trash. It was a simple task he'd done countless times, but he didn't mind doing it. He liked helping out. He put on his hoodie, grabbed the trash bag, and stepped outside. The street was calm, and he felt relaxed as he walked toward the curb. He had his headphones on, listening to his favorite song, and his thoughts drifted to the upcoming weekend and the friends he'd see at the game. But his peaceful moment was suddenly broken by the sound of a car pulling up beside him. He looked over and saw two police officers getting out. At first, he thought they were there for something unrelated, maybe checking on a neighbor. But when they walked straight toward him, his heart started pounding. "Stop right there," one of the officers said, and he froze, unsure of what he'd done wrong. He pulled his headphones off, confused and a little scared. They asked him what he was doing there, and he tried to explain, saying he lived just a few doors down and was only taking out the trash. But his voice was small, and the officers seemed tense. They kept questioning him, asking him things like where he was from, who he was, and if he was sure he lived there. He was trying his best to answer, but their serious expressions made him nervous. He had never been in a situation like this before, and he felt his hands start to shake. Just as he was about to explain himself again, he heard his mom's voice. She had noticed him taking longer than usual and came outside to check. She quickly walked over, clearly worried and trying to keep calm. She told the officers that he was her son and explained that he was only taking out the trash. The officers looked at her, then back at him, and finally seemed to relax a little. After a few more questions, they let him go, but by then, the moment had left a heavy feeling in his chest. Neighbors began to gather, wondering what had happened. Some were shocked, others visibly upset, talking among themselves. The boy's mother hugged him tightly, but he could feel her sadness and frustration. She looked at him with a serious, almost heartbroken expression, one that made him realize this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something bigger, something he didn't fully understand but felt deeply. That night, lying in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of fear and confusion. He thought about how quickly a simple moment had turned into something so serious. The questions kept repeating in his mind. Why did they stop me? Did they think I was someone else? Why didn't they believe me? It was an experience that left him changed. That feeling of being watched, of being treated like a stranger in his own neighborhood, lingered. He knew he'd be more cautious from then on, always aware of how others might see him, even when he was doing something as simple as taking out the trash. The next morning, the boy woke up feeling different. His house felt safe, but he couldn't shake the memory of the previous night. That uneasy feeling followed him as he got ready for school. His mom gave him a longer hug than usual before he left, and he noticed her worried expression. She seemed more protective, and he understood why. Something had changed between them two. She now looked at him with concern that hadn't been there before. At school, he tried to act normal. He laughed with his friends and went to his classes, but his mind kept wandering back to the encounter. Every time he heard someone's footsteps behind him or saw a teacher looking his way, he felt a little jumpy. It was like his mind couldn't relax. He hadn't done anything wrong, but somehow he felt he needed to prove that, to himself and maybe even to others. It was a confusing feeling, and he wasn't sure how to talk about it. That evening, his family sat down for dinner, but the mood was different. His dad seemed serious, glancing at him with a sad smile. His parents exchanged looks, and he knew they wanted to say something. Finally, his dad cleared his throat and looked him in the eyes. He began to talk, slowly and gently, about the world and how sometimes people see things differently, especially when they don't know you. He talked about how people can make assumptions based on things they don't understand. The boy listened quietly, taking in his father's words. His mom added that this wasn't his fault. He hadn't done anything wrong. They reminded him that he was a good kid, but they wanted him to be extra careful. He needed to be aware, they said, not because of anything he did, but because the world could be unfair. They spoke in a way that was honest yet comforting, making sure he knew he was loved, valued, and that they would always be there to protect him. For the first time, he understood a little better. It didn't make the experience any easier, but knowing his parents understood helped. Their words gave him a kind of strength, though it also left him with a quiet sadness. He wished he didn't have to think about these things, to feel the weight of their worry. Over the next few days, neighbors and friends who heard about what happened came by, checking in and offering support. Some brought cookies, others gave his parents a reassuring pat on the shoulder, while some simply nodded with understanding. He felt their kindness and realized that his neighborhood cared about him. It was a small comfort that balanced out the fear he still felt. Still, he found himself looking over his shoulder more often, feeling cautious even while doing simple things. It was hard for him to believe that his own familiar street, his safe place, could suddenly feel different. But slowly, he began to accept that this experience had changed something inside him. He knew he would always be a bit more watchful, always trying to stay aware of his surroundings. Even though he tried to move on, a piece of that night stayed with him, like a lesson he never asked for but now had to carry. He told himself he'd be stronger because of it, and maybe someday he'd help others understand too. A few days later, the boy noticed a change in how people around him acted. His close friends and neighbors were friendly and supportive, but he couldn't ignore how others in the area now looked at him differently. He would catch strangers giving him strange glances or watching him a bit too closely as he walked down the street. Some people seemed cautious around him, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. It left him feeling uneasy and more aware of his surroundings than ever before. At school, he felt the weight of it too. Some of his classmates had heard what happened, and a few teachers looked at him with concern. They didn't say anything directly, but he could feel their eyes lingering on him a little longer, as if they wanted to say something but didn't know how. He felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to just move on and forget about it, but another part wanted to speak up and let people know how it made him feel. It was confusing, carrying this mix of anger, sadness, and frustration, but he didn't know how to let it out. One afternoon after school, he was walking home when a woman in the neighborhood approached him. She was someone he'd seen around before, though they had never spoken much. She stopped him and gently asked if he was doing okay, saying she'd heard about what happened. Her voice was soft, and he could tell she really cared. She didn't pry or ask too many questions, just offered a few comforting words. He was surprised by how much that small gesture helped. It felt good to know there were people who understood, even if they couldn't change what had happened. As days passed, he began to think more about the way people saw him and how unfair it felt. He knew he was still the same kid he had always been, but he realized that people's perceptions could change in an instant. He'd done nothing wrong, yet he felt like he was constantly proving himself, even to those who already knew him. It was a heavy feeling, knowing that he couldn't fully control how others saw him, no matter how kind or respectful he tried to be. He started talking a little more with his parents about how he was feeling. They listened carefully, nodding with understanding, and reminded him again that none of this was his fault. They encouraged him to stay strong, to be himself, and to remember that he was loved and respected by the people who mattered. These conversations with his parents became a source of comfort, and he found himself leaning on them more. His parents' words helped him feel grounded, reminding him that he didn't have to face these feelings alone. One evening, as he sat with his dad, they talked about what it means to be resilient and how to turn difficult experiences into strength. His dad shared stories from his own life, times when he had faced unfair situations and had to find a way through them. Listening to his dad made the boy feel less alone. It reminded him that others had gone through similar struggles and come out stronger on the other side. Though he still felt cautious, these conversations helped him begin to see himself differently. He started to feel a sense of purpose, a quiet determination to rise above this experience. He didn't know exactly how, but he knew he wanted to make a difference, even if it was just by being kind and understanding toward others who might feel misunderstood. Slowly, he began to rebuild his sense of self, feeling a bit stronger each day. A few weeks later, life seemed to be settling back into its usual rhythm, but the boy still carried the memory of that night. Although he tried to go about his days as before, he couldn't forget how quickly things had changed in a place he thought he knew so well. Sometimes he'd look at the spot on the curb where the incident happened, feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't quite explain. One afternoon, after school, he met up with a friend at the basketball court near his home. They laughed, practiced their shots, and talked about their favorite players, just like they always did. But as they played, he noticed a few people nearby watching him in a way that felt uncomfortable. He tried to shake it off, telling himself he was just imagining things. Yet, deep down, he knew something had shifted. As they played, his friend noticed he was quieter than usual and asked if he was okay. After a pause, the boy decided to share what had been on his mind. He talked about how the incident had made him feel, how he was confused, hurt, and worried about how others saw him now. His friend listened closely, nodding and saying he understood. It felt good to share this with someone his own age, someone who wouldn't judge him, but just listen. Later that evening, as he walked home, he thought about how that simple moment of sharing had made him feel a bit lighter. He realized he wasn't alone, that there were people who cared about him and wanted to understand what he was going through. This gave him a sense of comfort, knowing he had friends and family who were there for him. It was a small reminder that he didn't have to carry this burden by himself. At home, he found his mom sitting at the kitchen table, reading a book. She looked up and smiled warmly as he walked in, and he decided to join her. They sat together quietly for a while, each absorbed in their own thoughts. After a few minutes, his mom put her book down and gently asked him how he was feeling about everything. She'd noticed how thoughtful he had been lately and wanted to make sure he knew he could talk to her about anything. He took a deep breath and told her more about how he felt, the way he sometimes felt like people were watching him differently, and how he was struggling to find his confidence again. His mom listened patiently, her face soft and understanding. When he finished, she reached across the table and held his hand, giving him a reassuring squeeze. She reminded him of how strong he was and how proud she was of him for handling everything with such maturity. She told him that, unfortunately, people sometimes misjudge others based on things they don't understand, but that didn't define who he was. "You're more than how others see you," she said softly. Her words made him feel a sense of calm he hadn't felt in a long time. She told him that what truly mattered was how he saw himself, and that he had the power to rise above this experience. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about his mom's words. He realized that he didn't have to let one moment change how he felt about himself. He could choose to stay strong and be the kind of person he wanted to be. It wouldn't be easy, but he felt a new sense of determination growing within him. He decided that he would hold onto the love and support he had from his family and friends and use it to move forward. The next day, he walked to school with a bit more confidence. He reminded himself that he was still the same person, no matter what others thought or assumed. This small shift in his mindset made a difference. He knew that there would be tough days, but he also knew he had people who cared about him, and that he had the strength to overcome whatever came his way. Over the following days, the boy felt a quiet strength growing inside him. The words of his mom and dad echoed in his mind, reminding him that he was more than how others might see him. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he could decide how he let it affect him. Each day, He tried to focus a little more on the things he loved and less on the worries that had weighed him down. One day at school, his teacher announced a new project. The class would be working on personal stories, where each student could share something meaningful from their lives. It was an open topic, and they could choose anything important to them. As soon as the teacher finished explaining, the boy's mind flashed to that night. He wondered if this could be a chance to share his story. At first, he hesitated, unsure if he was ready to talk about it. But something in him knew this was important, not just for himself, but maybe for others too. After school, he sat at his desk, thinking about how he wanted to tell his story. He thought back to that evening, to the fear and confusion he felt, and to the support he'd received afterward from his family, friends, and neighbors. He realized he wanted people to know what it was like, not to make them feel sorry for him, but to help them understand. He wanted to show that, even though the experience had been difficult, he'd have found strength in himself and in those who cared for him. He spent the evening carefully writing down his thoughts, putting into words the emotions he'd been carrying. He wrote about the moment the police approached him, the confusion that filled his mind, and how he'd struggled to understand why he was being questioned. He also wrote about his parents' advice, their love, and how their words had helped him feel seen and supported. Writing everything down made him feel lighter, as if he was letting go of a weight he'd been holding onto. The next day, when it was his turn to share, he felt a mix of nerves and excitement. He took a deep breath, stood in front of the class, and began to read his story. He noticed that everyone was listening closely, their expressions thoughtful. His teacher nodded with encouragement, and he felt reassured as he continued. He spoke honestly, telling his classmates about his experience, how it had changed him, and what he had learned about himself. When he finished, there was a pause in the room. Then, one of his classmates raised their hand and shared that they had felt judged before, too, though for different reasons, and that they understood a little of what he was saying. Another student shared their own story, and soon others began opening up about moments when they felt misunderstood. It was as if his story had opened a door, giving everyone in the room permission to be honest about their own feelings. After class, a few classmates came up to him to say thank you for sharing. They told him his story made them feel less alone, and he realized that sharing his experience had helped others too. It was a powerful feeling, knowing that his words had made a difference. He felt proud, not only for having the courage to tell his story, but for the connections it created with those around him. Walking home that day, he felt lighter, more hopeful. He realized that even though he couldn't change the past, he could use his experience to grow and to help others see things in a new way. He knew that, in sharing his story, he'd had taken a difficult moment and turned it into something meaningful. And that gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. From that day forward, he promised himself that he would continue to be open and honest, using his experiences to spread understanding and kindness wherever he could. In the weeks that followed, the boy noticed a difference in how he felt about himself and his surroundings. Sharing his story with his class had changed something within him. He no longer felt as weighed down by that difficult night. Instead, he felt stronger, more confident, and surprisingly, he noticed he wasn't looking over his shoulder as much. He still remembered the unease from that evening, but he had managed to turn that experience into a source of strength. At school, some of his classmates who had listened to his story would occasionally talk to him about it. They asked questions and showed genuine interest in understanding what he'd gone through. Their support felt real, and it showed him that they respected him for who he was, beyond any assumptions others might make. This made him feel more connected to his classmates than ever before. In a way, he realized that sharing his experience had allowed him to build trust with them, and he appreciated that deeply. One day, his teacher pulled him aside after class. She told him how brave she thought he was for sharing his story. She also mentioned that she'd noticed a positive change in how the class interacted. She explained that his openness had inspired others to be more understanding and supportive of one another. Hearing this made him feel proud, not in a big, showy way, but in a quiet, deeply satisfying way. He had always tried to be a good person, but this experience had taught him that sometimes being good also meant being open and honest, even about the hard things. The teacher then suggested that he might want to share his story more broadly, not just with their class, but perhaps with students in other classes or even in a school assembly. The thought made him nervous, but it also excited him. He wondered if, by sharing his experience with more people, he might help others who had faced similar situations. Maybe he could encourage other kids to be open about their own challenges, to know they weren't alone, and to remind them of their own inner strength. At first, he wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of attention. Standing in front of the whole school seemed intimidating. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt it was something he wanted to do. He knew his story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about creating understanding, about reminding people to look beyond the surface, and about encouraging kindness in a world that sometimes seemed too quick to judge. That evening, he told his parents about his teacher's suggestion. They listened, nodding with encouragement, and told him they would support him no matter what he chose. They reminded him that sharing his story was his decision alone, and they'd be proud of him whether he shared it with 10 people or 100. This reassurance made him feel even more confident. He knew he had his family's support, which was all he really needed. As he thought more about the idea, he decided to start small. Instead of a big assembly, he agreed to share his story with another class. He felt that if he took it one step at a time, he could build up his confidence and maybe, eventually, be ready to speak to the entire school. His teacher helped him prepare, and they even practiced together so he could feel more comfortable with what he wanted to say. When the day came to share his story with the other class, he felt nervous but ready. He took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was doing this, not just to talk about his own experience, but to help others understand and to make sure no one felt alone. As he started speaking, he felt his nerves fade, and his words flowed more easily. He shared his story openly and honestly, and just like before, he could see his classmates listening intently, some nodding, others looking thoughtful. When he finished, a few students raised their hands, asking questions and sharing their own stories. Once again, he felt that strong sense of connection, knowing that his words were helping to create a space for others to express themselves too. Walking home that day, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that his experience was making a difference. He knew now that he wanted to keep sharing his story, maybe even beyond his school someday. It wasn't just his story anymore. It had become a message of resilience, understanding, and kindness. And that realization made him feel prouder and more confident than ever before. He was no longer just the kid who had been misunderstood. He was someone who had found a way to turn a difficult experience into something positive, and he knew he would carry that strength with him wherever he went. As the weeks went by, the boy continued to find ways to share his story. Each time he spoke about his experience, he felt more confident, and he noticed that people were listening with a deep, genuine interest. He never expected that his story would resonate with so many people. What surprised him most was that even adults, teachers, neighbors, and family friends wanted to hear his story, and many of them came up to him afterward to express their support and admiration. One day, his school organized a small gathering where students were invited to share experiences that had changed them. The boy's teacher asked if he would be comfortable sharing his story in this setting. This gathering wasn't just for his classmates, but included students from different grades, parents, and even some community members. The idea of speaking in front of such a large group made him a bit nervous, but he also felt a growing excitement. This was a chance to share his journey with people outside of his usual circle, to reach out even further. The day of the event, he prepared carefully, thinking about what he wanted to say and how he wanted people to feel when they heard his story. He didn't want to make them feel sad or sorry for him. Instead, he wanted to share what he had learned, that difficult moments don't define who you are, and that with the support of those who care for you, You can find strength you didn't know you had. He wanted his story to inspire, to show others that no matter how tough things get, there's always a way forward. When it was his turn, he stepped onto the stage, took a deep breath, and looked out at the faces watching him. He began to speak, this time feeling less nervous and more certain of his words. He talked about the night he was unfairly questioned, the feelings of fear and confusion he experienced, and how he had struggled afterward to understand what had happened. He shared how his family's support and his own decision to open up about his experience had helped him find his strength again. As he continued, he looked around the room and noticed that people weren't just listening. They were truly understanding. He saw nods, gentle smiles, and expressions of empathy. Some parents even looked a little emotional, perhaps imagining how they would feel if their own child had experienced something similar. By the time he finished, the room was quiet, filled with a respectful silence that made him feel like every single person was with him, supporting him in spirit. Afterward, people came up to him to shake his hand, pat him on the back, or simply offer a few kind words. Many parents thanked him for sharing his story, saying it had opened their eyes and helped them understand things from a perspective they hadn't considered before. Some students told him they felt encouraged to share their own stories, inspired by his bravery and openness. Later, as he sat with his family, he felt a sense of peace and pride. His mom and dad hugged him tightly, telling him how proud they were of him, not just for sharing his story, but for turning a painful experience into a message of strength and understanding. They reminded him that by sharing his story, he wasn't just helping himself, he was helping others too. This realization made him feel fulfilled, knowing he had turned a difficult moment into something meaningful. As the days went on, he found himself more connected to those around him. His classmates looked at him with a new level of respect, not because of what had happened to him, but because of how he had handled it. They saw him as someone who had taken a hard experience and used it to bring people together, someone who had chosen to rise above judgment and fear. He started noticing small changes in the people around him too. Students seemed more understanding with one another, and he even heard conversations where people talked about treating others with more kindness and respect. His story had planted a seed, encouraging others to think more openly, to be more accepting. And he felt that this was only the beginning. The boy now understood that one person's story could have a powerful impact, creating ripples that spread further than he could have ever imagined. And even though he hadn't asked for this experience, he felt grateful for the strength and wisdom it had brought him. He knew that he had grown in ways he couldn't have predicted, and he felt ready to keep using his voice, wherever life might lead him next. As time passed, the boy's life slowly returned to its normal routines. But now, everything seemed a little different. He felt a new sense of confidence and purpose, something that hadn't been there before. He had always tried to do well in school, help his family, and be kind to others. But now, he felt he had a role that was even bigger than himself. He realized that by speaking up, he had become a voice for understanding, respect, and empathy. This gave him a quiet strength, something he carried with him in everything he did. One day, while he was working on a project in his school library, he noticed a younger student sitting alone, looking a bit upset. He recognized that expression. He had felt the same way once, confused and unsure. Taking a deep breath, he walked over and asked if everything was okay. The younger student looked up, a little surprised, but after a moment of hesitation, started sharing what was bothering them. It turned out they were dealing with some teasing and didn't know how to handle it. Listening carefully, the boy remembered all the support he had received from his family, friends, and even strangers who had encouraged him to share his story. He realized that just as he had found strength in the kindness of others, he could offer that same support to this student. He shared some words of encouragement, letting the younger student know that it was okay to feel hurt, but it was also important to believe in themselves. They didn't have to let anyone else's words define who they were. Seeing the gratitude in the younger student's eyes, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He hadn't done anything grand, just offered a few kind words, but he knew from experience that sometimes that was all it took. Even a small gesture could make someone feel seen and valued. As he walked back to his project, he felt a warmth in his heart, realizing that his journey had given him not just strength, but also a sense of responsibility to help others. At home that evening, he shared this small story with his family. They listened, smiling, proud of the way he was using his experience to make a positive difference in others' lives. His parents reminded him that true strength isn't just about standing up for yourself. It's about being there for others too, especially when they need it most. He nodded, understanding that sometimes the best way to heal from your own experiences is to help others feel safe and supported. In school, he began to notice little changes in himself and his classmates. He saw more students being open about their feelings, asking for help when they needed it, and supporting each other in small ways. His story and the openness it inspired had created an environment where people felt more comfortable being themselves. It was as if the walls that kept everyone apart had started to lower, and a new sense of unity was growing. One day, his teacher mentioned a community event coming up, where local residents could gather to discuss important issues and share their thoughts. The teacher suggested that he might want to attend, maybe even speak about his journey. The idea was both exciting and a little intimidating. Speaking in front of people he didn't know felt like a big step. But he also felt it was important. If his story could help even one more person, then it was worth it. That evening, he talked to his family about it. They encouraged him, reminding him that he had already made such a positive impact at school. Taking this step would allow him to bring his message of kindness, respect, and understanding to even more people. His mom gave him a reassuring smile, telling him that no matter how many people he spoke to, his words had power because they came from the heart. As he prepared for the event, he focused on what he wanted to say. He didn't want to just talk about the night he was questioned or how it had affected him. He wanted to talk about what he had learned since then, the importance of supporting one another, of looking beyond judgments, and of creating a community where everyone felt safe and valued. His story had started as something personal, but he now saw it as part of a bigger message. On the day of the event, he took a deep breath, knowing that this was another step in his journey. He felt nervous, but also proud, knowing he was about to use his voice to make a difference. As he looked at the crowd, he remembered the support from his family, friends, and classmates. They had been there for him when he needed it, and now it was his turn to be there for others. He started with the night that had changed everything for him. He described how he had felt confused and scared when the police had questioned him while he was just taking out the trash. He explained how he had struggled to understand why it had happened to him, and how those feelings had lingered in the days that followed. But instead of focusing only on the negative, he shared how he had found strength in his family and friends. He talked about their support and how it encouraged him to be brave enough to open up about his experience. As he spoke, he noticed the audience listening intently. He could see nods of understanding and empathy on their faces. He wanted them to understand that everyone has their struggles, even if they look different from the outside. He talked about the importance of kindness and respect, about how judging someone based on appearances can lead to misunderstandings and hurt. He urged everyone to take a moment to look beyond the surface and to really see one another. As he continued, he began to feel more at ease. He shared the story of how he had decided to speak to his classmates about his experience and how that had opened doors for others to share their own stories. He described how their classroom had transformed into a safe space, where everyone felt they could express their feelings without fear of judgment. This change was significant, and he wanted everyone to know that it was possible to create such environments wherever they were, at school, at home, or in the community. When he finished speaking, the audience erupted in applause. He felt a rush of warmth and pride. For a moment, it felt like the applause was not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt misunderstood or alone. It was a celebration of bravery and vulnerability, and it reminded him that sharing our stories is a powerful way to connect with one another. Afterward, many people approached him to express their gratitude. Some shared their own experiences of feeling judged or misunderstood, and he listened with an open heart. He realized that by sharing his story, he had created a space for others to feel safe enough to open up about their own challenges. Each story was different, but they all carried the same theme of overcoming difficulties and finding strength in community. Feeling inspired, he began to think about how he could continue this work. He talked to his teacher about starting a club where students could come together to share their stories and support each other. The teacher loved the idea and offered to help him organize it. This club could be a place for students to connect, share, and learn from one another, building a stronger sense of community within the school. In the following weeks, he and his teacher worked hard to set up the club. They created posters and announced it in the morning announcements, inviting everyone to join. They emphasized that this would be a space for everyone, where they could come together to listen and support each other, regardless of their background. The boy was excited to see how many students would want to join and share their own stories. When the first meeting finally arrived, he felt a mix of excitement and nerves. But as students began to fill the room, he felt a wave of joy. They were all there to connect, to share, and to listen. The boy welcomed everyone, explaining the purpose of the club and what he hoped they could achieve together. He encouraged each person to share their story if they felt comfortable, but he also made it clear that it was perfectly okay to just listen. As stories began to flow, the atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. Each student spoke openly about their experiences, and the boy could see the relief on their faces. They were finally able to express their feelings, share their fears, and support one another. The boy felt a sense of belonging grow stronger within him. He knew that this club was more than just a place to talk. It was a place to build friendships, to heal, and to grow together. Over time, the club became a cherished part of school life. More and more students attended, and they often found themselves engaging in deep discussions about empathy, kindness, and understanding. The boy watched as friendships blossomed, and he felt proud of what they had created together. He knew that the club was not just about sharing stories. It was about creating a community where everyone felt accepted, valued, and heard. And in that shared journey, he discovered not only his own strength, but also the strength of many others.